Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of precision. Like you expect it to be exactly like engineering, right? You break your arm playing a pickup game of basketball, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line right across the bone.
Right, yeah. It is totally binary.
Exactly. The doctor just points at the film and says, there it is.
It is an objective reality that literally nobody can argue with. I mean, the bone is either intact or it is fractured.
Yeah, broken or not broken, it is incredibly clean. But then, you step out of the hospital and into the world of modern culture. You look at sociology and the expectations placed on men today.
Oh yeah, it gets messy fast.
And suddenly that pristine x-ray machine is completely, just hopelessly broken. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape right now that is, honestly, it is so murky. And according to the absolute brick of a book we are diving into today, it is not just murky by some kind of historical accident.
No, not at all.
Right, it is deliberately, systematically rigged.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. We are living in an era where, well, the very definitions of psychological health, of biological normality, and behavioral pathology have been completely inverted.
Totally upside down.
Exactly. The traits that used to build nations are now being diagnosed as diseases.
And that inversion brings us to the core of today's deep dive. But before we get into the really heavy-hitting stuff, do me a favor. If you are listening to this right now, and I know you are because you are hungry for the actual truth behind the cultural static you hear every single day, take 1 second to like and subscribe to the show.
It really does help out a lot.
It tells the algorithms that this conversation matters, and trust me, you are going to want to be subscribed because today we are doing a massive, ultra-long, entirely unfiltered deep dive into one of the most provocative, explosive new ebooks to hit the digital shelves in years.
It really is explosive.
We are unpacking Discipline Under Pressure, Virtue, Tradition, and Perseverance by Conrad Riker.
It is a profound piece of work, honestly. It is incredibly detailed, heavily researched, and utterly unsparing in its critique.
It is way more than just a book. It is like a survival manual. If you are a man trying to navigate a world that constantly, implicitly demands your strength, while simultaneously punishing you the second you show it, this deep dive is specifically for you.
Absolutely.
We are going to unpack the intellectual, biological, and historical foundations of the modern men's rights movement and what is often called the red-pilled manosphere. Specifically, we are analyzing Riker's core, unyielding argument.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
Right, that Western institutions haven't just slowly drifted off course due to incompetence. He argues they have been actively captured and re-engineered by feminists and cultural Marxists to suppress masculine excellence.
He lays it out step by step.
So if this deep dive resonates with you today, and I promise you it will, you need to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the book. It is required reading. It will give you the language for things you have been feeling, but, just couldn't articulate.
Now, before we cross the threshold into the specific architecture of the arguments presented in this book, I do want to establish our ground rules for this exploration.
Good idea.
Look, the ideas we are about to unpack are highly radioactive. I mean, they are polarizing, they are politically charged, and they directly challenge the very foundations of mainstream contemporary thought.
Oh, absolutely. It is the third rail of modern discourse. People lose their jobs over discussing this stuff.
Exactly. So our goal today is not to tell you what to think. We are not here to explicitly endorse these viewpoints as objective truth, nor are we here to take political sides, play pundit, or preach to you.
We are just the guides today.
Right. Our mission is to act as your impartial, expert guides. Think of us as putting on our hazmat suits and stepping into the laboratory today. We are going to deconstruct these arguments, lay out the specific evidence provided, and explain the internal mechanics of this worldview.
So that you can fully understand the architecture of this movement. We want to show you exactly how and why this framework is resonating so deeply with millions of men globally right now.
Right, so let's unpack this. We have to start right at the psychological core of the book. The author identifies this massive, inescapable trap that he believes modern men are caught in.
He calls it the double bind of toxic masculinity.
Yes. And reading through this section, it is a brutal psychological assessment. He argues that men today are essentially trapped in a rigged game.
How so?
Well, society, on one hand, still implicitly demands that men be strong protectors, that they be providers, that they be the stoic pillars of their families and communities when things hit the fan.
Right, the traditional role.
But the moment a man actually displays that traditional strength, that assertiveness, or that dominance in his daily life, society immediately shames him and slaps the label toxic right on his forehead.
That is the first jaw of the trap. The book points out that the modern progressive narrative has actively pathologized the very evolutionary traits that historically built civilization.
Competitiveness, stoicism, aggression, the desire to conquer and build.
Right, these are no longer viewed by our culture as raw tools to be honed, disciplined, and directed toward a noble purpose. Instead, they are viewed as a disease. They are a contagion to be cured.
But the double bind requires a second jaw to actually crush the target. And this is where the analysis gets incredibly sharp.
Right, because society doesn't just say, you are toxic, it actually offers a cure.
Exactly. The culture tells men, hey, the cure to your toxicity is vulnerability. You need to open up. You need to cry. You need to share your deepest insecurities and feelings.
And the book says that is a complete, catastrophic bait and switch.
It argues that it's nothing short of strategic suicide. According to the text, when men actually take that advice, when they drop their guard and display raw vulnerability to their partners, their peers, or their employers, they are almost universally met with a subconscious, visceral contempt.
Wow. Visceral contempt.
Yes, they are viewed as weak, pathetic, and ultimately despised. And the cruelest irony is that they are often despised by the very people who relentlessly demanded they open up in the first place.
Man, that is rough.
The author describes vulnerability not as a brave strength, which is what the pop psychology books will tell you, but as an open wound in a culture that is actively hostile to men.
Right, like if you show your soft throat to a world that fundamentally resents your existence as a traditional man, you aren't building a connection, you are just inviting the blade.
Exactly.
I love the analogy you can draw here. It sounds exactly like being put in a rigged carnival game. You know, the one where the rings are physically too small to fit over the bottles, no matter how perfectly you throw them.
That is a great way to picture it.
You step up, you throw the ring of traditional strength and stoicism, it bounces off, the alarms ring, and you are labeled toxic. So you try a different approach. You throw the ring of emotional vulnerability and softness.
It bounces off again.
Right, the alarms ring. And you are labeled weak and discarded. So what is the actual mechanism here? What does this impossible game do to the psychology of an entire generation of men who are trying to figure out how to exist?
What it creates is exactly what is termed in the book as the masculine void. When there is no acceptable path forward, when every single direction a man steps leads to social or professional condemnation, men don't just keep playing the rigged game.
Right, they just check out.
Completely. They become paralyzed. They stop playing. If a man cannot be strong without being branded an oppressor, and he cannot be weak without being viewed as pathetic and undateable, he simply withdraws his participation from society.
And the book connects this psychological paralysis directly to the hard data we are seeing right now.
Skyrocketing male suicide rates, plummeting college enrollment for young men, and the massive epidemic of prime-age men just dropping out of the workforce entirely. We are looking at a generation of men who have been hollowed out.
Left entirely without a sanctioned purpose. And the book argues this purpose vacuum is an existential threat to civilization. It creates what is called the fatherless factor.
Right, where men, systematically stripped of their core identity as providers and protectors, are effectively replaced by the state. The matriarchal welfare system becomes the new husband and father, and the actual human men are rendered entirely obsolete.
Okay, I have to push back here though. Let's say we accept the premise that modern vulnerability is a total trap, an open wound, as he calls it. What is the alternative being presented?
That is a fair question.
How does a modern man process the intense, crushing pressure of life? You know, job loss, divorce, economic stress, without just resorting to the kind of emotional repression that, historically speaking, leads to a massive psychological breakdown.
Like the 1950s model.
Yeah, the stuff it down and drink yourself to sleep model. That had its own massive casualty rate. So if vulnerability is out, what is the actual mechanism for survival?
That is an essential question. And it is the perfect logical bridge into how the author grounds his entire philosophy. To escape the psychological trap created by modern culture, he argues that you have to bypass culture entirely.
Okay. So no more sociology.
Exactly. You have to stop looking to sociologists for answers and reconnect with hardwired, irrefutable biological truths. He asserts that what modern progressives sneeringly call emotional repression is actually a profound misunderstanding of the male biological superpower, which is emotional regulation.
Wait, explain the difference there because I think a lot of people conflate the two.
Repression is ignoring a feeling out of fear until it destroys you. Regulation is feeling the pressure, acknowledging the reality of the threat, and using sheer disciplined will to compartmentalize it so that you can continue to function.
To protect the people relying on you.
Right, and this is where the book makes a hard pivot from sociology into hard science. The author completely unequivocally rejects the prevalent academic idea that gender is merely a social construct, a performance we just invented.
To prove this, he brings up the iron law of anisogamy.
Yes.
This part was fascinating. Actually, I had to look this up when I was reading it.
It is the biological bedrock of his argument. Anisogamy is a principle established by evolutionary biologists Parker, Baker, and Smith back in 1972. It is the foundational cellular disparity between the sexes.
Okay, break that down for us.
Anisogamy refers to sexual reproduction involving the fusion of two completely dissimilar gametes. Let's look at the mechanics of this. The female gamete, the egg, is massive on a cellular level. It is rare, it is metabolically expensive to produce, and a woman only has a finite number of them in her lifetime.
Right, so they are incredibly valuable.
Exactly. Therefore, from an evolutionary standpoint, the egg must be guarded. It requires a massive investment of resources to nurture into life. On the exact opposite end of the spectrum, the male gamete, the sperm, is minuscule.
And super abundant, right?
Overwhelmingly abundant. And it is incredibly cheap for the body to produce by the millions every single day.
Right, so the biological cost of reproduction is vastly astronomically different between the two sexes right out of the gate.
Exactly. And the author argues that this fundamental microscopic cellular disparity is the absolute root of cross-cultural gender roles spanning over 200 millennia of human history.
Because sperm is cheap and eggs are expensive.
Yes, men are biologically engineered to be the disposable vanguard. They are wired to compete aggressively, to take massive physical risks, and to venture into dangerous environments to secure the resources necessary to support the resource-heavy female.
Wow, okay.
The male nervous system is built for a high-risk, high-reward existence. The book's thesis is that you cannot simply legislate away 200,000 years of evolutionary survival programming just because you handed out a bunch of gender studies degrees in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
The hardware is set.
And he doesn't just stick to cellular biology and theory. He brings up one of the most tragic, horrifying medical cases of the 20th century to prove his point about hardware versus software. The case of David Reimer.
It is a genuinely tough read.
It really is, but it is absolutely central to understanding his argument about the immutability of gender.
It is treated as the smoking gun for the thesis that biology is destiny. We have to look at the history here. In the 1960s, a botched circumcision procedure involving a cauterizing needle completely destroyed the genitalia of an infant boy named David Reimer.
Just awful.
At the time, there was a highly prominent psychologist at Johns Hopkins University named Dr. John Money. Money was one of the early pioneers of the theory that gender was entirely learned.
He thought it was 100% a social construct, right? Completely divorced from biology.
He believed a baby was basically a blank slate.
A completely blank slate. So, Dr. Money convinced David's devastated parents to raise their infant son as a girl. They named him Brenda.
Money orchestrated a regime where the child was pumped full of female hormones, dressed in girls' clothing, and subjected to horrific psychological conditioning to enforce a female identity.
And for years, Dr. Money paraded this case around the academic world. He published papers declaring it a massive success, using Brenda as the ultimate undeniable proof that nurture conquers nature.
And the academic establishment ate it up. It became foundational to modern gender theory.
But the reality behind closed doors was a complete, catastrophic failure.
An utter nightmare. David Reimer, despite having no male genitalia, despite the dresses and the estrogen, suffered immense, agonizing psychological distress. He inherently knew he was a boy.
His brain was bathed in androgens in the womb. His chromosomal reality was XY.
The biological hardware was screaming against the social software they were forcing onto him. Eventually, as a teenager, he discovered the truth of what had been done to him. He immediately rejected the female identity, stopped the hormones, and reclaimed his life as a man named David.
But the trauma was just too much.
It was. Despite getting married and trying to build a life, the profound psychological and physical trauma inflicted by this arrogant ideological experiment ultimately led to his tragic suicide in his late 30s.
Man, that is so sad.
The author uses this horrific story to state definitively, you cannot surgically or socially construct gender. The biological hardware always ultimately dictates the software.
So, to build on that tech analogy, the author is basically saying that modern progressive society is frantically trying to run iOS software on an Android phone. They keep pushing the update, they keep screaming at the phone to run the app, but the hardware just isn't built for it.
And so the entire system is crashing.
Right. The male brain is crashing, and he points to the actual biology of resilience to explain why it's crashing. There is a fascinating 2018 study published in Nature Communications that he cites.
Yeah.
It looks at how the male brain processes stress. It shows that acute stress actually improves glutamate transmission in the prefrontal cortex.
And we need to explain the mechanism of what that actually means because it's brilliant. Glutamate is the most abundant excitatory neurotransmitter in the human brain.
So it's basically the signal that tells neurons to fire.
Exactly. It's essentially the chemical signal that tells your neurons to fire rapidly and efficiently. What that study demonstrated is that when a male is subjected to acute, sudden stress, a threat, a high-stakes competition, a crisis, his brain floods the prefrontal cortex with glutamate.
The prefrontal cortex being the part of the brain responsible for complex decision-making, focus, and logic.
Precisely. So under pressure, the male brain doesn't naturally shut down. It chemically shifts into hyperfocus. It is an evolutionary trait meant to help a hunter lock onto prey or a warrior lock onto an incoming threat.
That is wild.
The author ties this biological mechanism directly to the concept of anti-fragility, a brilliant term coined by the risk analyst Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
Let's break down anti-fragility for the listener because it's distinct from just being tough, right?
Right. Taleb maps it out simply. Fragile things break under pressure, like a teacup. Robust things resist pressure, but they stay exactly the same, like a rock. But anti-fragile things are unique.
They actually get better.
Yes. Anti-fragile things actually require volatility, shock, and pressure to grow stronger. The author argues that male biology is the ultimate expression of anti-fragility. Think about how the human body works. How do you build muscle?
You don't do it by resting.
Exactly. You go to the gym, you lift heavy weights, and you literally inflict micro tears into the muscle fibers. You damage them. And in response to that specific stress, the body overcompensates and builds the muscle back thicker and stronger.
Same with bones, right? How do you increase bone density? You subject the skeletal system to physical load and impact.
So the masculine psyche functions exactly the same way as a muscle or a bone. It requires the tearing pressure of what psychologists call eustress, good stress, challenging stress, to develop its density and form. Without it, it atrophies.
So when we look at the modern safetyism culture, the trigger warnings, the safe spaces on college campuses, the overarching desire by HR departments and administrators to protect everyone from any form of psychological discomfort or harsh feedback.
The author views that safetyism not as compassion, but as a slow-motion biological starvation. By artificially sterilizing the environment of all risk, all competition, and all intense stress, society is effectively starving male biology of the vital fuel it needs to develop.
It is creating a generation of fragile, atrophied men.
Men who shatter at the very first sign of real-world pressure because they have been systematically denied the environmental inputs that would make them formidable.
I hear that, and the biology makes a ton of sense. But I have to play devil's advocate here because if I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, how does the book differentiate between a healthy biological drive for dominance, this anti-fragile growth, and just destructive, chaotic, violent aggression?
A very common critique.
Right, because if we just throw our hands up and say boys will be boys and unleash raw, unmitigated biological drive, doesn't all of human history show that can lead to absolute tyranny, warlords, and violence?
The author completely anticipates this pushback, and his answer is the bedrock of conservative thought, discipline, and structure. He argues that traditional patriarchy, as it existed in successful civilizations, was never about unbridled, chaotic aggression.
So it wasn't just a free-for-all.
No, it was never about men just running wild and doing whatever they wanted. It was an incredibly rigorous, demanding system of expectations designed to channel that raw, dangerous biological drive into duty, protection, and provision. The aggression wasn't eliminated because you can't eliminate biology, but it was harnessed.
Think of it like a nuclear reactor. Raw uranium is dangerous and destructive.
Exactly. But if you build a heavy containment structure around it and you use control rods, you can harness that terrifying energy to power an entire city. Traditional masculine virtues are the control rods.
Wow, okay, that's a powerful way to frame it. But if this biological blueprint for masculinity is so clear and historically so effective at building and maintaining civilizations, it raises a massive, glaring question.
How do we lose it?
Exactly. How did our modern institutions become so profoundly misaligned with it? If this hardware is so baked into our DNA, how did we end up in a culture that seemingly hates it and wants to medicate it out of existence?
And this is where the book transitions from biology into a deep dive on modern history. The author argues that this cultural hatred of masculinity wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a natural cultural drift over time.
Right.
He points to a deliberate, calculated historical infiltration, a slow-motion war of ideas that most people didn't even realize was happening.
He traces the origin of this ideological shift back to the 1930s. This is when the Frankfurt School, a group of Marxist intellectuals and sociologists who were fleeing the rise of Nazi Germany in Europe, brought their philosophy to the United States.
Specifically setting up shop at Columbia University in New York. We have to understand their mindset at the time. These intellectuals were confused and disappointed.
Disappointed because the workers didn't revolt.
Right. According to orthodox, economic Marxism, the theories of Karl Marx, the working classes of the industrialized world were supposed to inevitably rise up, violently overthrow the capitalist business owners, and establish a communist utopia. But that didn't happen in the prosperous West.
The American working class wasn't interested in violently overthrowing capitalism. They wanted to buy a Ford Model T and a house in the suburbs. Capitalism was actually providing them with an increasing standard of living.
So the Marxist intellectuals realized they had a massive problem. The economic pitch wasn't working, so they pivoted. They moved from economic Marxism to cultural Marxism.
Precisely. And to execute this pivot, they relied heavily on the theoretical work of Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci was an Italian Marxist philosopher who was actually imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist regime.
Right, sitting in his jail cell, writing what became known as his prison notebooks, Gramsci realized something profound.
He realized that a violent revolution will always fail if the everyday people still believe in the traditional morality and the cultural institutions of the dominant class. You can't just shoot the king if the people still love the concept of the monarchy.
Exactly. So Gramsci developed the concept of cultural hegemony. He argued that you do not conquer a stable Western civilization with tanks or guns or violent worker strikes. The West is too strong for that.
So how do you conquer it?
You conquer it by seizing its cultural narrative. It's what later became known as the Long March through the institutions. You take over the educational systems, the universities, the media, the entertainment industry, and eventually the courts.
You don't change the laws first. You slowly, patiently rewrite the underlying definitions of what is considered normal, what is virtuous, and what is pathological.
It's exactly like termites in the foundation of a house.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy. Think about it. The outside of the house looks exactly the same for decades. The paint is fine, the roof is intact, the lawn is mowed. You think everything is completely stable.
But beneath the surface,
Right. Beneath the surface, the structural integrity of the wood is being systematically eaten away from the inside out. And it happens in total silence until one day, the floorboards just collapse completely under your weight.
that is the exact mechanism the author is describing. And to carry your termite analogy further, he points to specific figures who acted as the queen termites, establishing the colonies inside our institutions. He highlights Paulo Freire.
Oh, Frere. Who is that?
He was a Brazilian educator who wrote a highly influential book in 1968 called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Now, unless you went to school for a degree in education, you probably haven't heard of Freire. But his theories revolutionize how teachers are taught to interact with students in the West.
The book claims Frere fundamentally transformed the classroom, right?
They did. Before Freire, the goal of education was objective. The teacher possesses knowledge, say algebra or history, and their job is to impart that objective knowledge to the student.
But Frere changed the entire dynamic.
He argued that the traditional teacher-student relationship was inherently oppressive. He reframed the classroom not as a place of learning, but as a power struggle battlefield. Instead of teaching objective facts, education became about critical consciousness.
Teaching kids to view any form of hierarchy, any traditional authority, or any objective standard as an inherent sin of patriarchal oppression that must be dismantled.
And the boiling point, according to the book, the moment this ideology fully breached the surface, was the 1968 student protests, specifically at Columbia University.
The author marks this as the historical turning point where academia officially shifted its core mission. It stopped being about the rigorous pursuit of objective truth and became an activist engine for the pursuit of social justice.
If we pull back and connect this to the bigger picture the author is painting, he is arguing that this historical institutional infiltration created the culture of extreme relativism we live in today.
Objective truth, biological reality like anosogamy, the concept of meritocracy.
These were all systematically deconstructed by these academics and labeled as tools of white patriarchal oppression. The author's thesis is that this calculated erasure of Western civilization's stoic masculine foundations was by design.
The goal was to break down the natural assertiveness of men to create a compliant, apologetic, easily managed population.
Exactly.
Okay, but let me challenge this framing, because this is where a lot of people might hop off the train. Is the author arguing that this is a massive, smoke-filled room, highly coordinated conspiracy, like a bunch of guys in dark cloaks sitting around a table plotting the downfall of men over the course of a century?
I know, it sounds like a movie plot.
Right. Or is he saying this was just a slow, natural evolution of academic philosophy that kind of snowballed out of control? Because the conspiracy angle is really hard to swallow.
He actually frames it less as a secret coordinated cabal and more as a highly successful self-replicating ideological virus. The initial architects at the Frankfurt School explicitly stated their goals to deconstruct Western values in their own writings. That's a historical fact, it's not hidden.
Okay, so the intent was there.
But once that theoretical virus was introduced into the university system, it didn't require a master conspirator to guide it. It became self-replicating.
How so? What's the mechanism of replication?
Hiring practices and peer review. A professor infected with this critical ideology only grants PhDs to graduate students who agree with their worldview. Those graduate students then become professors themselves.
Oh, I see.
When a tenure track opens up, they hire someone who shares their ideological framework. Over the course of 50 years, they slowly, methodically purge conservative, traditional, or purely objective thinkers from academia. It's not a grand conspiracy, it's just the natural, ruthless mechanics of ideological conformity within a closed system.
So the termites just kept breeding, unchecked. And moving from the historical theory to the harsh modern reality, the book looks at where these ideological termites are doing the most measurable, devastating damage to men today.
If these academics captured the institutions, what does that actually look like on the ground?
He takes us straight to the absolute battlegrounds, the education system, and the family courts. Let's look at the stats he pulls because they are staggering.
The demographic shift in the education system is a primary focus of his analysis. He highlights the terrifying statistic that men currently make up only about 40% of college enrollees, which is a catastrophic decline from nearly 58% in the early 1970s.
And the author's point is crucial here. He argues this isn't happening because young boys suddenly, mysteriously became less intelligent or less capable over the last 50 years. Biology doesn't mutate that fast.
Exactly. He argues the drop-off is because the educational environment itself has been structurally re-engineered to be actively hostile to how the male brain learns and operates.
He specifically calls out the elimination of vocational shop classes in the 1990s as a massive blow. For decades, if you had a boy who was hyperkinetic, who couldn't sit still at a desk reading poetry for 8 hours, you put him in woodshop or auto mechanics.
You gave him a physical, hands-on problem to solve, and he thrived.
By systematically removing those paths from public schools, the author argues the system essentially created a massive demographic of what he calls disposable males, men who have no clear path to dignified labor.
And he draws a direct line from that educational exclusion straight to the modern opioid crisis and the surging rates of deaths of despair among working-class men.
To prove that this is an environmental failure and not a biological one, he contrasts the public school system with the example of the Princeton Charter School. They looked at the declining performance of boys and decided to do something radical.
They adapted a structured, highly competitive Socratic method specifically tailored for boys' inherent learning styles. They allowed for physical movement, they encouraged debate and competition.
And what happened?
The results were immediate and dramatic. A 34% boost in reading comprehension among the boys, and a massive 52% drop in disciplinary incidents. The author uses this data point to prove that when you stop pathologizing boyhood energy, when you stop diagnosing a boy's natural kinetic drive as ADHD and drugging him with amphetamines just to make him sit still and act like a compliant girl, and instead provide rigorous competitive structure, boys thrive.
He even notes the disastrous 1920s Soviet experiment with completely gender-neutral education.
Oh, that's a fascinating piece of history.
The Bolsheviks tried to abolish all gender distinctions in schools, treating boys and girls exactly the same. It resulted in such profound social chaos, delinquency, and academic failure that the Soviet state eventually had to quietly revert to traditional sex-segregated learning models.
It's a historical lesson the author says modern progressives are willfully, blindly ignoring.
And listen, if his breakdown of the education system makes you angry, his analysis of the family court system is just harrowing. He describes the modern family court not as a place of justice, but as a bureaucratic apparatus designed specifically to harvest men.
The statistics he cites are brutal.
Despite all the talk of equality, fathers get primary custody less than 15% of the time. Yet men pay roughly 97% of all alimony, despite the fact that women now comprise nearly 50% of the modern workforce.
He frames the family court system as the ultimate weaponized implementation of feminist ideology. It is where theory becomes violent legal reality. He highlights a deeply disturbing 40% surge in domestic violence restraining orders filed specifically during the onset of divorce proceedings.
And he says those aren't real cries for help, right?
According to his analysis, the vast majority of these are not genuine, terrified cries for physical protection. They are cold, tactical legal weapons. A lawyer advises a woman to file a restraining order because it immediately removes the man from the home, secures de facto primary custody of the children for the mother, and paints the father as a violent abuser to the judge.
All without requiring the actual burden of criminal proof. It's a legal checkmate before the game even begins. And he also brings up the cancellation of Dr. Richard Gardner, which is a wild story I had never heard before.
Dr. Gardner was a highly respected psychiatrist who identified and coined the term parental alienation syndrome, or PAS.
This is the phenomenon where, during a bitter divorce, one parent systematically, psychologically brainwashes a child to fear and hate the other parent, which statistically is usually the father.
Yes. Gardner's work was groundbreaking because it finally gave a clinical diagnosis to the emotional abuse fathers were experiencing. But the book argues that Gardner was systematically targeted and professionally destroyed by the feminist legal establishment.
Why? Because his diagnosis of PAS threatened their incredibly lucrative litigation strategies.
Exactly. If a judge recognized PAS, a mother could lose custody for emotionally abusing the child. By launching a smear campaign against Gardner and successfully lobbying to keep PAS out of the diagnostic manual, the courts effectively removed a vital legal defense for fathers whose children were being weaponized against them.
Furthermore, the author points to the absolute tyranny of a legal concept called imputed income. Wait, explain imputed income to me, because this sounds like something out of a dystopian novel. How can a court tax you on money you aren't actually making?
It is arguably one of the most destructive mechanisms in family law. Let's say a man was working on an oil rig making $120,000 a year. He is divorced. Child support is calculated based on that high income.
Makes sense so far.
A year later, the oil market crashes, he loses his job, and the only work he can find pays $50,000 a year. He goes to the judge and asks to lower his child support because he literally doesn't have the money.
And what does the judge say?
Under the doctrine of imputed income, the judge can look at his work history, decide he has the theoretical capacity to earn $120,000, and order him to keep paying child support at the six-figure level. The court simply imputes or assigns him a phantom income.
That is insane.
When he inevitably falls behind because the math is impossible, he goes into arrears, his driver's license is suspended, and he is eventually thrown into debtor's prison for contempt of court. The author argues that this proves the system does not view fathers as human beings who suffer economic hardships. It treats them merely as theoretical labor engines to be harvested for cash.
It sounds exactly like trying to play a professional sport where the referee is actively changing the rules in the middle of the game to ensure you lose, and then fining you for having the audacity to complain about it.
Totally rigged game.
But if the family court system is as profoundly rigged and hostile as the book claims, what is his actual tactical advice for a man who finds himself currently trapped inside that meat grinder? How do you survive that?
His advice is brutally pragmatic. He argues that the absolute worst mistake a man can make is expecting fairness or justice from a system specifically designed to destroy him. You must drop the illusion of the noble court.
So what do you do?
He advises men to approach family court with cold, unfeeling, stoic strategy. You must document every single interaction, every text message, every phone call. More importantly, you must completely remove all emotional reactivity.
Because they'll use it against you.
If your ex-wife tries to provoke you and you get angry, that natural anger will instantly be weaponized against you as proof that you are unstable or dangerous. You must embrace the grim reality that the state views you as a utility, and you must fight not for moral fairness, but for pure strategic leverage.
Utilizing the exact same ruthless, dispassionate legal tactics that are being deployed against you. So, no more Mr. Nice Guy in court. You have to become a machine. And the struggle doesn't end after you survive school or after you survive a brutal divorce. The author argues this ideological net follows men right out of the courtroom and straight into the corporate workplace. So if these men are being pushed out of academia and decimated in family courts, they have to go somewhere to survive, right?
They still have to earn a living.
Let's look at where they spend most of their waking hours. We're looking at section 5 of his argument, corporate castration and the religion of victimhood.
This is where the book brilliantly connects the obscure academic theories we discussed earlier directly to the modern, everyday workplace. He dissects what he calls the religion of victimhood and specifically targets the framework of intersectionality.
Right, intersectionality, it's a massive buzzword. But what does it actually mean in practice, according to the book?
Intersectionality was a legal theory coined by a scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. Initially, it was meant to map out overlapping, intersecting systems of discrimination, how being a woman and being a minority might compound the discrimination someone faces.
Okay, that makes sense in theory.
But the author argues that as this theory leaked out of law schools and into corporate HR departments, it mutated. In practice today, it has created a new, incredibly rigid moral hierarchy. It's an oppression Olympics, where your moral worth in a corporation is determined by how many marginalized identities you can claim.
And in this new intersectional caste system, the straight, white, biological male is systematically placed at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. His opinions matter least, his promotions are least prioritized, and his inherent traits are viewed with the most suspicion.
Exactly. And human resources departments are basically acting as the high priests and inquisitors of this new religion.
The author says modern corporate HR functions essentially as re-education camps. They do not want your authentic self no matter what the posters in the break room say. They want castrated compliance.
They want you to apologize for your inherent privilege.
They want you to check your masculinity at the door and sit quietly through mandatory diversity trainings that explicitly demand you suppress your natural competitive male instincts to make others feel more comfortable.
What's deeply fascinating here is how the author takes this beyond just corporate annoyance. He links this ideological shift directly to catastrophic, physical, systemic failures in the real world.
Like actual disasters.
Yes. He argues that when an institution replaces true, ruthless meritocracy and competence with ideological conformity and diversity, equity, and inclusion metrics, that institution becomes fundamentally, structurally fragile.
And he brings the actual receipts on this. He doesn't just theorize, he points to massive recent disasters. He cites the spectacular 2021 collapse of Silicon Valley Bank.
A huge failure.
He details how SVB leadership proudly prioritized diversity and inclusion initiatives, spending massive amounts of time and capital on ESG scores, while simultaneously completely ignoring fundamental baseline risk management practices regarding interest rates. They focused on ideology over math, and it destroyed a massive financial institution.
He also points to Boeing's recent terrifying aerospace disasters, literally having doors blow off commercial airplanes mid-flight. He argues this is the inevitable, deadly result of a corporate culture that decides to prioritize DEI hiring metrics and supplier diversity over ruthless, unforgiving engineering excellence.
It is the ultimate fatal price of the religion of victimhood. The author's point is chillingly simple. Gravity doesn't care about your intersectional identity. Metal fatigue doesn't care about diversity goals.
Right. When perceived oppression becomes more valuable to a company than actual rigorous competence, bridges fall down, planes crash out of the sky, and massive economies tank.
He also scales this critique all the way up to the globalist agenda, specifically taking aim at Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. Their notorious, widely publicized mantra, "You will own nothing and be happy," is interpreted by the author as a direct, calculated attack on the fundamental masculine biological drive.
Men are wired to conquer, to build, to own property, and to establish a tangible legacy to pass down to their children. Telling men to rent pods and eat bugs while owning nothing is an attempt to completely domesticate the male spirit.
It's like taking the absolute fastest runners in a race, the Olympic gold medal sprinters, and forcing them to wear heavy 40-pound lead weights strapped to their ankles just so everyone else in the race crosses the finish line at the exact same time. It completely destroys the pursuit of excellence in the name of forced equality.
That's a perfect analogy.
But I have to ask a practical question here. If corporate America is demanding this total ideological submission, and the globalists at the WEF are trying to strip away private ownership, how does the book suggest a man actually make a living today?
He has a clear answer for that.
How do you build wealth and provide for a family without compromising your soul in a corporate cubicle? Does he just want us to all go live off the grid in the woods?
Not at all. His answer is not a retreat into the primitive wilderness. It is the aggressive, strategic embrace of the masculine entrepreneur. The author argues that the only viable solution to the corporate trap is to bypass the HR labyrinth entirely.
So you just tap out?
You have to tap out of their system and embrace the raw, untamed drive of the founder. And once again, he looks at both modern evolutionary biology and hard historical data to prove that this specific high-risk environment is where men naturally chemically thrive.
Right, he backs this up with hard science. He dives into the actual biology of the entrepreneur. He cites a 2014 University of California study on the MAOL gene. Now, explain the mechanics of this because it blew my mind.
The MAOL gene is a specific genetic variant that affects an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. This enzyme is responsible for breaking down neurotransmitters in the brain, like dopamine and serotonin.
Okay.
Men with the MAOL variant process these chemicals differently, which is linked directly to higher rates of novelty-seeking and entrepreneurial risk-taking behavior. Basically, their baseline requires more stimulation.
So, a risk that would terrify a normal person, like quitting a stable job to start a company with no safety net, actually provides the precise chemical stimulation this male brain craves.
The author points out the hypocrisy. This inherent genetic risk-taking behavior might be punished and pathologized in a corporate diversity seminar, but historically, it is the exact biological engine that drives human innovation.
Furthermore, he points to a 2018 study in the Journal of Neuroscience regarding how dopamine interacts with the male brain's reward system, which he dubs the founder's addiction.
The obsessive, relentless, borderline insane drive required to build a massive empire from scratch isn't a learned behavior. It's fueled by a highly specific neurological profile.
He references Peter Thiel's famous book, 0 to 1. Thiel, the billionaire founder of PayPal, made a fascinating observation. He noted that many highly successful entrepreneurs possess traits that modern society might label as mildly autistic.
Meaning they have an extreme, unyielding focus on systems and goals, and they completely ignore social niceties, office politics, or people-pleasing in pursuit of a singular vision.
Which is exactly the type of intensely focused, unsocialized behavior the modern education system desperately tries to medicate out of young boys with Ritalin and Adderall.
Exactly. And he gives massive real-world examples of this unchained male drive. He talks about Elon Musk famously working 120-hour weeks during Tesla's production hell in 2017.
Literally sleeping on the concrete factory floor under his desk because he refused to let the company fail. He brings up Bill Gates doing insane multi-day programming marathons in the early days of Microsoft, eating powdered Tang right out of the jar because he didn't want to waste time cooking.
The author says Musk and Gates didn't succeed by attending HR seminars on checking their privilege. They succeeded through sheer, overwhelming force of will, biological endurance, and obsessive focus.
And the book scales this individual drive up to the societal level, introducing a concept he calls patriarchal prosperity. He directly challenges the dominant feminist historical narrative that the 1950s were a dark, miserable age of oppression.
Instead, he says, look at the objective economic data. During the 1950s, operating under traditional patriarchal family norms, single-earner households didn't just survive, they thrived massively.
U.S. Census data shows median home values increased by an astonishing 43% from 1950 to 1960. A man could buy a house, buy a car, take a vacation, and raise a family on a single working-class income.
Because economic specialization works. The book points out that the modern system still subconsciously rewards this traditional structure. He cites the fatherhood wage premium, where married fathers earn about 6% more than childless men.
And the broader marriage premium, where married men earn anywhere from 10 to 40% more than their single counterparts. Why is that? Why do married men make so much more money?
The author argues it's because when a man is freed from domestic duties and focuses entirely, ruthlessly on his duty as a provider, he becomes hyper-competitive and hyper-productive. The entire family unit benefits from that specialization.
He extends this historical view to the Industrial Revolution, noting that 94% of British patents between 1760 and 1840 were held by men operating in highly competitive, exclusionary, masculine frameworks.
The thesis is mathematically clear to the author. Societies flourish, economies boom, and technological innovations skyrocket when men are allowed to exercise their natural authority and competitive drive without progressive interference telling them to tone it down.
He even brings in Robert Putnam's famous sociological data from the book Bowling Alone. Putnam found that community organizations with traditional hierarchical male leadership structures actually maintain a 65% higher civic participation rate than modern, gender-neutral, consensus-based alternative.
The traditional order actually builds community because it creates a disciplined, structured environment where violence and chaos are suppressed through the credible threat of strength.
Rather than endlessly negotiated through weakness and committee meetings. I love this analogy. It's like a lone wolf leaving a highly managed, sterile zoo. In the zoo, the keepers throw him pre-cut meat, they manage his temperature, they keep him perfectly safe, but he's miserable in pacing the cage.
He leaves the zoo to go hunt in the wild. It is infinitely more dangerous out there. He might starve, but it's what he was biologically born to do.
But pushing back on his examples, is the author honestly suggesting that the extreme 120-hour-week sleep on the factory floor grind of an Elon Musk is the baseline standard every single man should aim for? Because that burns a lot of guys out. It destroys marriages. Is there a way to achieve this patriarchal prosperity on a more relatable, everyday scale?
The author clarifies this. He isn't saying every man must be a billionaire tech mogul. He uses Musk merely as the apex, undeniable example of the unchained male drive working at its absolute limit.
Okay, that makes more sense.
For the everyday man, achieving patriarchal prosperity means rejecting the corporate HR labyrinth and owning your own labor. That might mean starting a localized plumbing business, building a regional contracting firm, or launching an independent digital venture.
The scale of the business doesn't matter. The autonomy and the alignment with your biological duty as a primary provider are what generate the prosperity and the psychological stability. It's about not having a master.
Exactly.
Okay, so to survive outside the corporate zoo, to build your own independent empire, a man needs profound mental resilience. And, crucially, he needs a tribe. This takes us to the next phase of the book, true stoicism and the necessity of brotherhood.
The author spends a massive amount of time reclaiming the ancient concept of stoicism.
Yes, and he is highly aggressively critical of the modern pop psychology version of stoicism that you see all over Instagram.
He specifically calls out authors like Ryan Holiday, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Who he accuses of selling a corporate-friendly, sanitized, neutered version of stoicism. The author argues that modern pop stoicism is essentially designed just to make you a better, more compliant employee. It teaches you to accept your terrible boss and your low wages with a smile.
Right. The author says true. Historical stoicism isn't about accepting weakness. It's about forging an unshakable will that terrifies weak people. He points to Admiral James Stockdale as the ultimate modern example.
Stockdale survived 7.5 years of unimaginable torture in the Hanoi Hilton as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. Stockdale didn't survive by journaling or processing his vulnerability with his captors.
He survived by bending the bars of his own mind until they broke. He took absolute tyrannical control over his internal fortress, refusing to break even when his body was being destroyed.
The author also points out a massive intellectual theft occurring in modern psychology. He traces the origins of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which was developed by psychiatrist Aaron Beck.
CBT is considered the gold standard of modern therapy. But the author argues that CBT is essentially just repackaged, plagiarized Stoic mechanics. It teaches you how to control your emotional response to external stimuli.
However, he argues that modern psychology stole a mechanical engine of Stoicism while completely discarding its moral spine, the four cardinal virtues of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance.
Without those hard, masculine virtues guiding the ship, the author argues that CBT therapy just creates highly functioning, self-obsessed neurotics who are great at managing their anxiety but have no higher moral purpose or courage.
And here's the kicker. To cultivate those virtues, to build that true Stoic courage, you cannot do it alone in your bedroom. You need a brotherhood. You specifically need male-only spaces.
And this is where the author really goes to war with modern feminist ideology. He looks at history to prove his point. Look at Aristotle teaching at the Lyceum in ancient Greece, surrounded exclusively by men engaging in brutal philosophical debate.
Look at the medieval guild systems, passing down highly specialized trade secrets and rigorous standards from father to son.
Look at the Enlightenment societies, the secret clubs where the American and French revolutions were plotted in smoky, men-only rooms. Greatness, he argues, requires male exclusion.
He relies heavily on the work of evolutionary psychologist David Geary here to explain the mechanics of why this is true. Geary's research proved that male competition and cooperation evolved in specific high-stakes environments, like hunting massive predators or fighting rival tribes.
Environments that are entirely distinct from female bonding strategies, which evolved around child rearing and social cohesion.
Right. Men and women are biological organisms wired for different roles, and therefore we require completely different environments to reach our maximum potential. When men are in an exclusive male-only space, they engage in a raw, intellectual, and physical combat that actually sharpens them.
They insult each other, they challenge each other, they test each other's physical limits, and it changes them biologically. This blew my mind.
The author cites the modern men's group movement, specifically an organization called the Mankind Project and their new warrior training adventure retreats.
They took blood samples and demonstrated measurable, statistically significant increases in the participants' testosterone levels after a weekend of intense male bonding and physical challenges. Just being in a challenging, exclusive male brotherhood literally alters your hormonal profile. It chemically turns you back into a warrior.
Which is exactly why, according to the author's deeply cynical view, modern feminism has fought so relentlessly to destroy these spaces. He points to the weaponization of Title IX in the 1970s.
Let's explain Title next, because most people just think it's about making sure girls get a soccer team at high school.
Right, that was the selling point. Title IX was passed to ensure equal funding in federally funded educational programs. But the author argues it was rapidly weaponized far beyond sports funding.
It was used as a legal bludgeon to dismantle male sanctuaries everywhere, from forcing male-only fraternities and social clubs to co-integrate, to establishing campus tribunals that strip young men of due process.
The author argues this relentless push for inclusion isn't actually about equality, it is a diabolical, calculated strategy. Feminism, as an ideology, depends on men remaining in a permanent state of psychological inadequacy, constantly dependent on female validation and HR approval.
By destroying the exclusive environments where men naturally forge their strength, their independence, and their self-reliance, you keep the male population docile and easy to manage.
It's the difference between a greenhouse and an open field. Think about it. Certain plants, certain crops require an incredibly specific, harsh soil, high winds, and specific weather conditions to force them to grow deep roots and strong, thick stalks.
If you take those seeds and try to grow them in a nice, pleasant, climate-controlled greenhouse right next to the delicate orchids, they wilt. They grow tall and thin and snap under their own weight. They need the harshness of the field to become what they are supposed to be.
That is an excellent analogy. The male psyche absolutely requires the intense friction of brotherhood to hone its edge.
But I've got to ask, if the goal is male excellence, why is the explicit exclusion of women so incredibly central to this framework? Couldn't you just have a positive focus on male bonding, like a men's retreat, without making it aggressively about barring the door to women? Why the strict, hardline segregation?
Because the author argues that the mere physical presence of a woman, fundamentally, instantly alters male behavior on a biological level. Men are biologically wired to protect, impress, and accommodate women.
So they just act differently.
Yes. The moment a woman enters the room, men will subconsciously lower their aggression, they will censor their raw discourse, and they will shift from a state of authentic brotherhood into a performative state of competing for female attention.
The unvarnished truth, the brutal, harsh accountability, and the specific competitive dynamics that actually forge masculine strength can only occur when the female dynamic is completely 100% removed from the equation.
He argues it's not out of hatred or misogyny, it's out of a necessary biological quarantine to allow for authentic male development to take place.
Wow. Which leads us perfectly to the ultimate conclusion of the book. If the institutions are totally captured by Marxists, if the family courts are completely rigged against you, if corporate America wants you castrated and compliant, and if you biologically require male spaces that the government is trying to outlaw, what do you actually do?
The author answers this with a blueprint for the future. He says, you build a parallel civilization.
This is the culmination of his entire thesis. The author advocates for what he calls the modern citadel approach. He isn't just speaking in abstracts, he provides a tangible working template.
He points to the Iron and Ink Collective down in Austin, Texas. In 2018, these men realized the culture was hostile. But they didn't just complain anonymously on internet forums, they used the actual legal code to protect themselves. They established a 501c7 social club.
Break down the mechanics of a 501c7 because that is a massive loophole.
It is a specific IRS tax-exempt status designed for social and recreational clubs. By organizing legally under this code, private clubs have massive constitutional protections regarding freedom of association. It means they can legally discriminate regarding who they allow to be members.
So, Iron and Ink created a legally protected, exclusive male space. They serve over 400 men, providing deep mentorship, brutal physical training, and business networking. And because of their legal structure, they're completely insulated from diversity consultants, discrimination lawsuits, and HR oversight. They built a fortress.
And it doesn't stop with physical clubs. The author is talking about building a parallel public square digitally. He looks at the recent release of the Twitter files.
Which definitively proved that the mainstream tech platforms and government intelligence agencies were working together to systematically suppress conservative, traditional, and masculine viewpoints.
So he says, we don't beg them for our accounts back. We abandon them. We use alternative, decentralized platforms like Rumble for video, Substack for writing, and Locals for community building to bypass technocratic censorship entirely.
He points to the conservative media company The Daily Wire as the ultimate proof of concept for this parallel economy. They reached a staggering $100 million valuation in just 5 years.
And they didn't do it by softening their message or compromising with mainstream advertisers. They did it by speaking unapologetic truth to power, building their own distribution network, their own razors, their own movies, and relying entirely on direct support from a disenfranchised audience.
The author identifies a massive $200 billion untapped market for male-focused services. We're talking about healthcare tailored specifically for men's biology, business networking devoid of DEI requirements, and independent educational models for boys.
Businesses that explicitly serve men and absolutely refuse to apologize for masculinity.
He even talks about utilizing decentralized blockchain technology, like Bitcoin, to create uncensorable financial systems, because he knows that the final weapon of the woke corporate state is financial deplatforming.
When they try to freeze your bank accounts or cancel your credit processing for having the wrong opinions, blockchain ensures they can't touch your money. You literally have your own sovereign economy.
It's like looking at a massive, collapsing, termite-infested house. You realize you can't renovate it, the wood is rotten, so instead of arguing with the termites, you just walk across the street, buy an empty plot of land, and pour a brand new, unshakable concrete foundation.
That is precisely the vision the author is laying out. It is a strategic, calculated withdrawal from a dying system to build fortresses of traditional values. It is about achieving physical, economic, and digital sovereignty designed explicitly to outlast the inevitable catastrophic collapse of woke institutions.
But what is the ultimate endgame here? I mean, is the author advocating for a total permanent separation from mainstream culture? Like, are we talking about becoming the Amish, but armed with crypto wallets and podcasts?
Or is this parallel economy meant to eventually grow so strong and wealthy that it turns around, conquers, and replaces the mainstream?
The author views the parallel economy as an arc. He believes that the progressive mainstream, built on the fragile, contradictory foundation of relativism, victimhood, and anti-biology, will inevitably collapse under the crushing weight of reality.
We already discussed his examples of SVB and Boeing. You cannot defy the laws of economics and physics forever. When those mainstream structures finally fail and shatter, the parallel institutions built by disciplined, highly capable, traditional men will be the only functioning systems left standing.
They won't need to fire a shot to conquer the mainstream. They will simply inherit the earth when the progressive experiment inevitably bankrupts itself.
Wow, okay, we have covered an absolutely massive amount of ground today. We've gone from the psychological double bind of modern men deep into the evolutionary biology of stress and anosogamy, through the Marxist capture of our universities and family courts, through the corporate HR re-education camps, all the way to the blueprint for building a completely sovereign parallel civilization.
It is a comprehensive, meticulously researched, and an entirely unyielding worldview. And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, lingering idea to mull over based on the architecture we've unpacked today.
Throughout modern history, rebellions and countercultures have almost always been associated with chaos, with tearing down the old order, with riots, and with progressive change. But what is the ultimate, most dangerous, and most effective rebellion of the 21st century is actually a return to hyper-discipline, ancient tradition, and stoic order.
If a massive demographic of highly capable, technically skilled, driven men quietly withdraws their labor, their ingenuity, and their physical protection from the mainstream system to build a parallel economy, how long before that parallel economy simply becomes the new world?
That is a profound thought that stays with you, and it brings us right back to where we started. The rigged carnival game. The modern world has handed you rings that are physically too small to fit over the bottles, and they expect you to just keep throwing them, keep losing your hard-earned money, and keep feeling like a toxic failure.
Riker's message is incredibly simple. Stop throwing their rings, walk out of the carnival, build your own game.
If you are a guy waking up every day feeling like the rules keep changing, this book is essentially handing you the blueprints to the Matrix. If you want the full, unfiltered strategy to reclaim your discipline, your economic independence, and your sanity, you need to read this book.
Check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy Discipline Under Pressure by Conrad Riker. And to stay on the absolute front lines of this conversation as it develops, make sure you follow the author directly.
You can find his long-form essays on Substack at Conrad Riker. You can get his real-time updates on Twitter at Conrad Riker. And you can watch his video breakdowns on YouTube at Conrad Riker.
Finally, do not forget to like and subscribe to this deep dive right now. We take the noise of the culture, we put on the hazmat suits, and we distill it into the hardcore knowledge you need to survive. You will not want to miss our next exploration into the sources shaping our world. Until then, stay disciplined.